Hello everyone, welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. On the very first day of 2024, a powerful earthquake with a preliminary magnitude of 7.6 struck Japan. It has already been a week since the Noto Peninsula in Ishikawa prefecture was hit by the country's deadliest earthquake in nearly 8 years since Kumamoto earthquakes in 2016. But there are still hundreds of people missing. Rescue operations continue, but due to adverse weather and the fact that it is a peninsula region with low accessibility, they are being hampered. How is the current situation in quake-hit central Japan? For this, we have Walter Sim, Japan correspondent from the Straits Times. Thank you for your time, Walter.
My pleasure.
All right, Walter, first question. It has already been a week since a massive earthquake hit Japan's Noto Peninsula. What is the death toll and how many are still missing? And is it true that it is difficult for humanitarian aid to reach most areas due to severe weather conditions right now?
Yes, indeed, it has been a week since the New Year's Day earthquake, as you pointed out, and the situation remains extremely dire on the Noto Peninsula, which some in Japan have referred to as an island on land. So you could just imagine how difficult it is to get there. I'm currently now in Ishikawa prefecture and have been spending time yesterday and today within the hardest hit areas, speaking to survivors, and many of them have told me that the earthquake was unlike anything that they have ever experienced before. The latest toll as of this afternoon was 168 dead and 323 people unaccounted for. And I think the death toll looks set to rise as rescue teams race against the clock to look for more survivors to dig through collapsed buildings. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's government has indeed said that the aid is difficult to reach the hardest hit areas, as you have pointed out in the question. I do think there is some truth to this, and personally, driving into and out of the quake areas has really been quite a nightmare because of terrible road conditions and icy roads following last night's blizzard, for instance. Air and sea access is also quite limited because of the very rough terrain and waters in the region. But that said, however, I think not everyone agrees with Prime Minister Kishida's assessment, and his response has been criticized as slow, particularly amongst people with experienced volunteers, for instance, and especially the evacuees. And I think that there are grounds for this criticism because at least 2,000 people are still isolated and absolutely no relief, no food, no water has reached them, and it's been a week since the earthquake. There's also not enough food and water for survivors in many evacuation shelters in the worst hit areas, let alone other things that I think you and I take for granted, such as electricity and heating. So I think the situation is really very bad.
All right, I see. Thank you for your update, Walter. It's quite unfortunate to hear that the situation has not improved that much. Walter, since the 7.6 magnitude rattled the Ishikawa prefecture, I saw the report said aftershocks had been hitting the region. Could you tell us more about the tremors and aftershocks the region has been seeing?
Yes, it has really been very bad. There have reportedly been over 1,000 aftershocks that measure at least one on Japan's own Shindo seismic intensity scale. So most of the aftershocks, however, have been weak to moderate earthquakes, though one last night had a magnitude of 4.7. It's also worth pointing out, I think, that before the big earthquake hit on New Year's Day, there were as many as 500 tremors experienced by the Noto Peninsula before the big one. So I think the fear is that the earthquakes prior to the New Year's Day quake, as well as the New Year's Day tremor, and the aftershocks now would cause even more damage because it would have weakened the foundations of buildings. Another considerable factor that you pointed out earlier that has been hampering rescue and relief efforts is really bad weather. The blizzard that pounded Noto Peninsula last night has accumulated so much snow that it's a clear landslide risk. Icy roads have hampered relief efforts of vehicles going in and out the region, and the accumulated snow could also cause more buildings to collapse under the weight.
All right, I see, Walter. I'd like to also ask you about the impact on nuclear power. When the massive 9.0 magnitude quake previously hit Japan in 2011, it triggered a tsunami that swamped the Fukushima nuclear power plant at that time. And so this recent quake also raised concerns over potential damage to nuclear plants. Was any damage reported right now?
Thankfully, this time, the nuclear power plants in the region seem to have escaped major damage. The plant operators have all said that there has not been any external radiation detected. Naturally, I think such a major earthquake would raise questions over the safety of nuclear as a power source, but much of the Japanese public opinion, I think, has shifted in favor of nuclear because it's crucial for Japan to have any chance of reaching its net zero carbon neutrality goals by 2050, as well as, inflation due to external events like the Russia-Ukraine war also means that nuclear power is pretty much the only green option that Japan has right now to keep electricity costs down. So I think that's why, whilst public opinion has once been very much against nuclear power, in the wake of the 2011 earthquake, it's now shifting in favor of it.
All right, I see. Well, it's quite fortunate to hear that no damage has been reported regarding this nuclear power plant. Walter, many regions and countries offered aid, as far as I know, but Japan reportedly decided to only receive aid from the U.S. Is there any specific reason for this, and how have discussions developed so far regarding getting aid from Washington?
Indeed, I kind of get the sense, to be honest, that Mr. Kishida's government seems to have been caught on the back foot by the exact scale and extent of damage in the region, and I think he's kind of trying to make up for things. Having faced a lot of criticism, especially from on the ground, from evacuees and from experienced volunteers who say that even more could have been done. As you highlighted out earlier, humanitarian aid is indeed difficult to reach the hardest hit areas on land, but there have been voices asking why is aid not being dispatched by sea or by air. So I think the government is kind of, the Mr. Kishida's government kind of have to balance things on these fronts, whilst there are truths that, it's very difficult to access the area by land. But I think he is also trying to grapple with the need to identify more routes, more avenues to bring relief aid in. The hardest hit areas, to be frank, are not quite capable of housing large numbers of volunteers, it seems. And I think this is one primary reason why Japan is reluctant to, have large numbers of foreign volunteers come in at this point. Nonetheless, I do think that, the US is, after all, Japan's only ally. And I guess Mr. Kishida finds it a natural fit for Japan to look towards the US in times of need. I'm not quite sure what special considerations were given to the US's offer, though, or in what ways, America's offer might have differed from those of other countries and regions. So I can't quite comment on that. I'm sorry.
All right, I see, Walter. Well, I believe this would be our last question. We have been keep talking about Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's efforts, though there could be differing views. Could you tell us what plans for rescue and relief have been drafted up until now, and how will victims be assisted?
Right. I think the most immediate measure that Mr. Kishida's government is planning is to designate the disaster as an extremely severe one during a cabinet meeting tomorrow. So what that would do is to unlock funds in terms of special financial aid and give the government more leeway in terms of dispersing relief and financial aid to the hardest hit areas. So that's going to happen tomorrow. Besides that, Mr. Kishida has also drastically increased the number of self-defense forces troops on the ground. From the initial 1,000 that were deployed on January 1st, the government has raised the number of soldiers to 6,400 in hopes of speeding up the restoration and relief efforts. I do think, however, that one key turning point to watch out for will be when the runway of Noto Airport is finally repaired. The airport is, as of now, scheduled to reopen on January 24th, and that will naturally offer another route into the area other than land for relief efforts to go in.
All right. Well, that's all I have for you, Walter. Well, hopefully Japan can quickly recover from the damage and those affected will be able to return to their daily lives as soon as they can. Thank you for the update, Walter.
Thank you very much.
All right, we have asked Walter about the status quo in Japan after the recent massive earthquake. Let's now turn to an expert to ask the reason why such a quake occurred on the western side of Japan and whether this was a sign of a much bigger earthquake to come. We also aim to ask what South Korea needs to do in order to prevent such natural disasters. And for this, we invite Professor Chung Sok-ho from Changwon National University. Welcome to the show, Professor Chung.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, my name is Sok-ho.
All right, Professor Chung. Until now, major earthquakes with a magnitude of 7 or higher in Japan have mainly occurred on the eastern side, as far as I know, such as the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. Why was there such a big earthquake on the western side of Japan this time?
Japan, as you know, is one of the most seismically active countries located at the plate boundary. Earthquakes are very common at plate boundaries, and the eastern and the southern side of Japan are right on the boundaries, and that's why they have lots of large earthquakes. As you move away from these boundaries, earthquakes become obviously much less frequent. But the western side of Japan, in my opinion, is still not far enough away, meaning that they can still get large earthquakes, just not as frequent as right on the boundaries. In fact, there has been a number of moderate-sized earthquakes which did some damage, and some people seem to suggest that the Noto Peninsula earthquakes is likely part of an ongoing earthquake swarm that started in 2020. And from this, it seems that this earthquake was going to happen, and it was just a matter of time.
All right, I see. Professor Chung, you have already mentioned that Japan is the birthplace of seismology and that it sits on the Ring of Fire. And so Japan is well known as a country that is well prepared for such earthquakes. But why has the aftermath of the recent quake been difficult for Japan to deal with?
Yes, Japan is very seismically active, and it is known to be well prepared for earthquakes. They have a lot of experience, and I'm sure that they are doing their best to deal with the aftermath of this earthquake. But looking at the information that I can find, this earthquake was extremely intense. Seismic stations near the epicenter recorded very large accelerations, and some of them show up to almost 3 times the gravitational acceleration, which is not very common to find. And near the epicenter, the recorded seismic intensity was 7, which is the highest in the Japanese intensity scale. Unfortunately, several populated areas in Noto Peninsula were exposed to this strong shaking, which led to the collapse of many buildings. The strong shaking also damaged infrastructure, leading to the disruption of transportation network and water and power supply. And many buildings caught fire, which adds up, and which can be, and this fire can be caused by the damage to gas pipes and power lines. And during the earthquake, many homes were destroyed, especially older timber buildings, which weren't up to the seismic standard. And some people managed to evacuate, but a lot of them would have been trapped inside waiting to be rescued. Timing is critical for such rescue efforts, but emergency services are being hindered by the damaged roads, lack of communication, and buildings being burned down.
Oh, I see.
And all these things make situation very difficult.
Right. Thank you for your explanation, Professor Chung. According to the Japan's Geospatial Information Authority, the powerful earthquake caused crustal changes of up to 3 meters in the Noto region. The Korean Peninsula has not seen any impact from it yet, fortunately, but what happens when there are crustal changes, and if there were any, what impact could it have had on the Korean Peninsula?
Yes, crustal movement can permanently change the topography. In fact, this earthquake has lifted some part of the Noto Peninsula, and it is known that the coastline advanced up to 20 meters offshore because of this earthquake. So such large crustal deformation can have some practical implications. For example, the locations of survey control points would be shifted, which means that they will then need to be re-established afterwards. Another concern is that it can impact the marine environment. And one example is that in 2016 Kaikoura, New Zealand earthquake, the seabed was raised because of the earthquake by several meters. Then thousands of marine creatures were exposed and they were left to die. And some people estimated that it will take more than 10 years for them to get back to normal. So, and typically, large crustal deformation occurs in the vicinity of faults that have slipped. And according to a published study, South Korea experienced up to 55 millimeters of crustal deformation due to the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. So it wasn't as large as what was recorded at the epicenter region. But I think the crustal deformation of South Korea caused by the Noto Peninsula earthquake would be much smaller because this earthquake is much smaller earthquake compared with the 2011 Tohoku earthquake.
All right, I see, Professor Chung. I'd like to also ask you about South Korea. South Korea is no longer a safe zone from earthquakes as well. And in fact, the data revealed that earthquakes with a magnitude of 2.0 or higher on the Korean peninsula and its surrounding waters increased by more than 20% compared to the previous year in 2023. How concerning is this? And if it is concerning, what should the South Korean government do in order to be better prepared for this?
The long-term seismicity can fluctuate due to many reasons. For example, published studies reported increased seismicity in the Korean peninsula after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. Still, South Korea is in a stable continental region, which means that it is not as seismically active as some other countries. However, low seismicity regions can get damaging earthquakes. 2016 Gyeongju and 2017 Pohang earthquakes are really good examples of such cases, and there are other examples in other countries as well. The problem is that we have been only recording earthquakes in South Korea for 50 years or so, and people who never experienced strong earthquakes in their lifetime, as it was the case in Noto Peninsula earthquake, they don't consider earthquake as a potential threat, and until they experience one, then it might be too late, right?
All right, I see. Professor Chung, may I ask if there is anything South Korean government could do in order to better prepare for this?
Right. I realized that after the Noto Peninsula earthquake, the government announced a plan to reinforce major public facilities by 2035. I looked at the plan and I like to say that public facilities are easier to retrofit because the government owns them. But case study shows that the major loss is actually from the private buildings. Older buildings without proper seismic reinforcement are a major cause of fatalities, as it was shown in Noto Peninsula case. Most of these are residential buildings and smaller commercial buildings. The government plan includes encouragement for seismic retrofitting of private buildings, which seems to include incentives. I doubt the effectiveness of this policy, and the reason is that people who live in vulnerable buildings are usually unable to afford the retrofitting cost. After the 2017 Pohang earthquake, for example, many people had to evacuate because their homes became uninhabitable. They could not afford to fix their homes. They could not afford to move to other places. I think the government needs to consider implementing a policy that can boost disaster insurance penetration so that affected people can actually afford to pay for the repair or relocation after the disaster.
All right, I see, Professor Chung. Now, before we wrap up the show, could you share information about what steps we need to follow in order to be safe when earthquakes and tsunamis hit?
Right. Korean government, to be specific, Ministry of Interior and Safety has published a really good manual with extensive information about what to do in an earthquake event. I think people need to be aware of potential disaster risk in their surroundings in general. Damaging earthquakes can happen in Korea, and if a moderately large magnitude 6 earthquake strike any major city in Korea, it can do a lot of damage. And studies suggest that we cannot completely rule out such an event. In general, when you get an intense shaking, you need to drop cover and hold, and you will need to evacuate to a wide open space immediately after the shaking has stopped. Tsunami-wise, only very large earthquakes can generate significant tsunami, and it is unlikely, I think, that we will get a tsunami from a domestic earthquake. But a large earthquake in the western Japan may generate a tsunami that can impact the east coast of Korean Peninsula. In that case, we will likely get a warning, and when that happens, we will need to move higher up away from the coast as quickly as possible.
All right, thank you for your safety tips, Professor Chung. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Chung, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.